Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Laleh Bakhtiar, who has retranslated the Sublime Quran. Now, there is a lot to learn about the Quran. Many of us are concerned about it. Many of us don't know anything about it except what we've heard. In fact, this translation by Dr. Laleh Bakhtiar is going word for word into what the prophet said 1,500 years ago. This is the first time a woman has ever translated the Quran. It's a blockbuster and monumental task. You should also know that Dr. Bakhtiar has written over 50 books, not only the Sublime Quran, but Sufi expressions of the mystic quest, moral healing through the most beautiful names, the practice of spiritual chivalry. It goes on and on. She is practically a theologian, and she is doing something very controversial but very necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Laleh Bakhtiar to It's Rainmaking Time. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
The first thing I want to say is that you have tremendous courage to go into the ancient book of your culture and correct mistranslations along the way, 14 to 1,500 years. I am sure that there's a lot of people who like you and there's a lot of people who don't like you. Do you agree?
Yes, well, that's for sure.
I noticed that you have a background in Sufism.
Yes.
Share a little bit about that.
Well, the Sufi path is the mystical dimension of Islam, and it's where you concentrate more on self-development and introspection and trying to make yourself into a better person. So it's basically the moral kind of arm of Islam. And once you have done that, then you're ready for the world of intuition, which if you get that far and, struggle that hard, then you move towards, sainthood or the highest kind of level of the mystical dimension.
So could we say that Sufism has influenced other traditions as well?
Yes, Sufism has definitely been influenced by other traditions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism and, so many, Christianity, Judaism, their mystical dimensions, like the Kabbalah and so forth. But it has also influenced other traditions as well.
When did you get into Sufism? And the reason I'm asking you about this first is because my understanding through the Sufi books that I've read is that it can definitely guide your life.
Yes, it definitely does. I met my teacher, my mentor, Syed Hossein Nasser, who is now George Washington university professor at George Washington University. I met him in Iran many years ago when I lived there, and he asked me what religion I was and practiced, and I said, well, I've grown up as a Christian because my parents were divorced and I lived with my American mother here in the States. So he said, well, now you're in Iran and everyone expects you to be a Muslim because your father is, and so you need to, become a Muslim. And I said, well, I don't know anything about Islam. So he said, well, learn. And because he himself was a Sufi, he brought me into the Islamic path through Sufism, which is a different way of bringing people into the faith. It's based on the love of God rather than the fear of God. And because I realized that I would not be losing Jesus, who was very important in my life, but I would be gaining Muhammad, so it was not a difficult step to take. I also realized that within the Sufi tradition, when I say love of God, how it begins is by not doing what God has asked you not to do. Whereas when you're brought into Islam through the fear of God, you're taught this is what you have to do. You have to pray, you have to fast, you have to go on the pilgrimage. You're given all these kind of
rules
and injunctions. And when it's first to begin by not doing what God has asked you not to do, which is basically in the Islamic tradition, not to gamble, not to drink alcohol, not to take interest from somebody, and not to eat pork, then you're holding back in a way, and it brings you, in a sense, closer to God because you're actually holding back from doing something. and kind of withdrawing from the world rather than immediately learning the prayers or learning to fast and so forth. So that was how I came into Sufism.
You have gone to great lengths in the Sublime Quran to explain all the details of how you went, instead of translating from verses word for word. Share that with the public and talk about the moral equivalence. Bring the context of how this translation came about and the methodical way in which you went about it.
Well, it began really, I was very disheartened by the other translations, not only by the format, which is, I find, a real problem, but also by the fact that there's so many additional words. And for someone who wants to learn the Arabic, it's very difficult. You can never find exactly the Arabic word that you're giving an English equivalent for, or you're interpreting with several words. So I realized, because I'd had a degree, my PhD in educational psychology, so there we had studied instruments and the importance of reliability and consistency in a test that you might develop or in any kind of an instrument. And so I thought, well, this is what a sacred text also needs to have, is this internal consistency and reliability. So I realized the only way that you could get to that in a translation of the Quran, because I translated many books from the beginning to the end, and I realized that in the middle I had forgotten what word I'd used, and so I would come up with a synonym and so forth. So in this case, I began with the words instead of with the paragraphs. And I wasn't sure that this method was going to work. It was kind of a scientific experiment. Like, I had a hypothesis, can I do this? Will this work? And so it took, I was 2 years into it because I first had to transliterate all the Arabic words because my computer at that time didn't have an Arabic program. And there is an Arabic concordance called the Mujam, and so I was using that to begin translating the words. That lists all the words in the Quran in Arabic with the small description of each of the verses. So I began there, and 2 years into it, I was talking to a friend and saying that, I was doing the translation of the Quran, and I wasn't sure if my method was going to work and so forth. And so he said, oh, that's how they can't translate the King James Version of the Bible. I said, what? In the 17th century, they did this, and here I'm thinking that I've come up with a new method, and it's been done, and it was done so well, and so you can do it that way. And I was so it was so heartwarming to hear this and encouraging to me that the method that I had just kind of come across or kind of thought about actually could work. So that's how I translated it, and then I presented it in a format where there are just a few Arabic words for every few English words, and so it's not a paragraph format where it's so hard to find the original word that you're looking for. That way, people can much more readily learn the Arabic of the Quran. So it's kind of a mirror process where you mirror the Arabic with the English.
In the beginning, you talked about how translators of the Quran used to infuse their ideas and thoughts of the text rather than just translating the words.
Yes.
How do you know that?
Well, because when you find just one word in Arabic and then you find like 2 sentences translation in English, you realize, well, this is a lot of extra information here that is not necessarily in the Arabic. It may be that is an interpretation of what that word means, but that's not exactly what that word is. And so then you have, and that system, that's called dynamic equivalence, but the method I used is called formal equivalence. So with formal equivalence, there's no bias or doctrinal information, because no matter who the person is, even if they try to be objective, it is still their interpretation of the Quran. And it's not really a straight translation. So I felt that we needed to have at least one English version that would be from the woman's perspective. And I should say, I'm the first woman to do a critical translation of the Quran. There were others whose translations are exactly like the men's translations. They didn't look at the verses from a woman's perspective. So that makes it different in that sense.